There's a moment almost every person eventually reaches after enough time spent loving a narcissist, a moment of genuine, exhausted clarity where a single thought finally crystallizes. Being nice isn't working, and it never actually was. This realization arrives slowly, usually, worn down by years of watching kindness get absorbed without reciprocation, patience get mistaken for permission, gentleness get treated as an invitation to push further rather than a reason to pull back. And once this realization fully lands, a new question immediately follows, one this entire conversation is going to answer directly. If not nice, then what? Let's start by understanding exactly why nice fails so consistently against narcissistic psychology, because this understanding is the foundation for everything we're going to replace it with today. Nice, in the way most people practice it instinctively, involves a specific set of behaviors, softening difficult truths to avoid conflict, over-explaining decisions in hopes of securing agreement, extending patience indefinitely in hopes that patience will eventually be met with change, prioritizing the other person's comfort, even when that comfort comes at your own expense. This approach works reasonably well with people who have the capacity for genuine reciprocity, people who register your kindness as something deserving of matched consideration in return. Remember everything we've traced across many previous conversations about narcissistic psychology specifically. Niceness, deployed towards someone with this particular psychological structure, doesn't register as an invitation to reciprocate. It registers as information, specifically information about how much can be extracted before any genuine resistance appears. Every softened boundary, every extended patience, every prioritized comfort teaches him something concrete, that this particular behavior produces no real cost, which means there's no actual reason to adjust his own conduct in response to it. This is why being nice so consistently fails, and understanding this mechanism clearly removes any lingering self-blame about why kindness alone never seemed to produce the outcome you were hoping for. It was never a failure of your kindness. It was a fundamental mismatch between what kindness requires in order to function, genuine reciprocal capacity in the other person, and what narcissistic psychology actually offers in return, which is often nothing at all. So what replaces it? Here are the first three shifts, with more to follow. First, replace explanation with statement. Nice explains. It justifies, contextualizes, offers reasoning designed to secure understanding and agreement. This instinct, however well-intentioned, hands a narcissist exactly the material his defensive system knows how to work with: details to argue against, context to reframe, reasoning to dismantle piece by piece until you're apologizing for a boundary you never should have had to defend in the first place. The replacement isn't coldness. It's simple, factual statement delivered once without ongoing justification. I won't be able to do that. Full stop. If pressed for reasons, you can decide in that moment how much you genuinely want to share, but the boundary itself doesn't require his approval or understanding in order to remain valid. Second, replace hope for change with observation of pattern. Nice keeps giving second chances, extending grace toward the possibility that this time will be different. The replacement involves something we've discussed extensively throughout this series: tracking actual behavior over time, rather than extending belief based on words or isolated moments of apparent remorse. This isn't cynicism, it's simply requiring evidence before continuing to invest. Third, replace performed forgiveness with genuine pause. Nice rushes to declare things fine the moment tension arises, because unresolved discomfort feels worse than premature peace. The replacement is simply allowing a moment to remain unresolved until you've actually decided how you feel about it, rather than manufacturing quick reassurance that costs you the chance to genuinely process what happened. Part 2. Let's continue with the remaining shifts because each one addresses a different piece of the same underlying pattern. Replacing instinctive accommodation with something that actually protects you rather than simply feeling more comfortable in the immediate moment. And it's worth pausing here to notice something important before we continue. Every single shift we've covered so far, and every one we're about to cover, shares the same underlying architecture. Each one removes something a narcissist depends on in order to operate effectively, without requiring you to raise your voice, without requiring you to prove anything, without requiring his cooperation at any point in the process. Fourth, replace overavailability with delayed response. Nice answers immediately. Nice drops whatever it's doing the moment a text arrives, the moment a call comes in, the moment any form of urgency gets communicated, because Nice has learned to treat someone else's timeline as automatically more important than its own. This instinct feels like generosity in the moment, even like basic responsibility, the kind of reliability a good partner or family member is supposed to offer. But against a narcissist specifically, it functions as confirmation of something he depends on believing without ever having to test it directly. That your attention remains permanently, reliably available on demand, regardless of what you were doing, regardless of what you actually needed in that particular moment, regardless of whether his message even represented anything genuinely urgent at all. Remember what we discussed extensively throughout previous conversations about manufactured urgency, the way narcissists frequently create crises, specifically because urgency bypasses careful thought, pulling you into immediate reaction before you've had time to actually evaluate whether the situation deserves the response being demanded of you. Immediate availability, offered automatically and without discrimination, hands him this tool freely, every single time, without his even needing to work particularly hard to activate it. The replacement is deliberate delay, not as punishment, and this distinction matters enormously because delay deployed punitively is simply another form of engagement, still oriented entirely around managing his reaction. Genuine delay is different. It's authentic reclamation of your own timeline, responding when you're actually ready to respond, rather than when his manufactured urgency demands it. This removes one of the most reliable levers he has for bypassing your own judgment and pulling you into his preferred pace instead of your own. This might mean letting a message sit for hours, sometimes longer, before responding, even when every habitual instinct pulls you toward immediate engagement, even when some part of you still feels a flicker of anxiety about what might happen if you don't respond right away. Over time, this single shift alone begins to fundamentally alter the entire power dynamic because it demonstrates, consistently and without a single confrontational word ever needing to be spoken, that his sense of urgency doesn't automatically become yours simply because he's decided it should. Fifth, replace visible reaction with calm observation. Nice reacts. It shows the hurt, the confusion, the frustration, often immediately and visibly, because Nice assumes, reasonably in most ordinary relationships, that showing genuine feeling will eventually produce genuine understanding in return. Against a narcissist, visible reaction functions as exactly the feedback his manipulation tactics depend on to calibrate and refine themselves further. Every flinch, every scramble to explain your own hurt, every visible sign that a particular comment landed exactly where it was aimed, hands him information about precisely where your vulnerabilities live and how effectively his tactics are currently working, information he'll use, consciously or not, to refine his approach even further the next time. The replacement isn't suppressing genuine feeling, and this distinction deserves real emphasis because it's easy to misread this entire approach as advocating for emotional shutdown. Remember what we discussed extensively in our conversation about non-reactive empaths, the crucial distinction between healthy emotional sovereignty and unhealthy suppression. You still feel everything fully, sometimes even more intensely than before, because you're no longer spending energy performing a reaction for someone else's benefit. You simply choose, deliberately, when and with whom that feeling gets externally expressed, rather than broadcasting it automatically in real time to someone who will only use it against you later, in some future conversation, dressed up as evidence of your instability or your excessive sensitivity. This might mean noticing internally that a comment genuinely stung, processing that sting privately, or with someone who has actually earned your vulnerability through demonstrated trustworthiness, while offering him nothing but calm, unreadable neutrality in the actual moment itself. This isn't dishonesty. It's simply recognizing that not every space, and certainly not every person, deserves witness to the full truth of what's happening inside you, especially when that person has repeatedly demonstrated they'll use exactly that truth as ammunition rather than honoring it. Sixth, replace preemptive justification with simple decision. Nice explains itself before anyone's even asked, front-loading every choice with defensive reasoning in anticipation of pushback that hasn't happened yet and might never actually materialize. This preemptive habit hands a narcissist material to dismantle before he's even had to work for it, because there's already a justification sitting on the table, fully formed, ready to be picked apart, questioned, reframed, and used as leverage for exactly the kind of prolonged negotiation that eventually wears you down into either caving completely or exhausting yourself defending a decision that never actually needed defending in the first place because it was always entirely yours to make. The replacement is simple, undecorated decision-making offered without the anxious scaffolding of justification wrapped around it. I won't be attending. Full stop. No immediate anxious elaboration explaining exactly why, no lengthy paragraph designed to preempt every possible objection before it's even been raised. If he asks why, and sometimes he will, you decide in that specific moment how much you actually want to share, rather than handing over your reasoning automatically, freely, before it's even been requested. This shift alone often produces genuine confusion in someone accustomed to negotiating around whatever justification you've always provided in advance, because there's simply nothing yet on the table for him to work with. Seventh, replace consequence tied to his understanding with consequence tied to the behavior itself. Nice calibrates its response according to how much the other person seems to comprehend the impact of what they did, softening consequences whenever confusion or apparent ignorance gets performed convincingly enough, extending grace toward the possibility that maybe, this time, he genuinely didn't realize how much a particular comment or action would hurt. This instinct assumes good faith that a narcissist's psychological structure often doesn't actually possess in the way this instinct requires, which means consequences calibrated according to his apparent understanding rarely function as genuine deterrents at all, because the performance of confusion becomes, over time, simply another reliable tool for softening whatever response his behavior might otherwise produce. The replacement is consistency independent of his comprehension entirely. If a specific behavior crosses a line you've genuinely identified as important, the consequence follows, cleanly and reliably, regardless of whether he seems to understand why, regardless of how convincingly he performs confusion, regardless of how earnestly he claims he didn't realize or didn't mean it that way. This isn't punitive, and it doesn't require anger or coldness to enforce. It's simply accurate, informed response based on demonstrated behavior over time, rather than performed understanding that has, historically, rarely translated into anything resembling actual, sustained change. Together, these 7 shifts, statement instead of explanation, pattern observation instead of hope, genuine pause instead of performed forgiveness, delayed response instead of over-availability, calm observation instead of visible reaction, simple decision instead of preemptive justification, and consistent consequence instead of understanding dependent leniency represent a fundamentally different way of engaging with someone who has never actually earned the kind of unlimited access and endless second chances that being nice so consistently, exhaustingly provided him throughout the relationship. None of this requires you to become cruel, cold, or unrecognizable to yourself in order to finally, genuinely protect your own well-being. It simply requires you to stop offering exactly the material his psychology has always depended on receiving in order to continue operating the way it always has. Because here's what these 7 shifts ultimately have in common: the thread that ties them all together into something considerably more powerful than any single behavioral change could achieve on its own. None of them require his participation, his agreement, or his cooperation in order to function completely. This is precisely what separates them from being nice, which, however well-intentioned, always depended on his reciprocity in order to actually work, and consistently failed precisely because that reciprocity was never genuinely available in the first place. Let's be honest about something important before we close, because it matters enormously for how you actually carry everything we've discussed today into your own life. These 7 shifts will not, by themselves, transform him into someone capable of genuine change. Remember everything we've traced across this entire series about the structural nature of narcissistic psychology, the way accountability threatens a self-concept that has no foundation solid enough to survive genuine acknowledgement of harm caused. These shifts weren't designed to fix him. They were never built as a strategy for producing his transformation. They were designed to protect you entirely and completely, regardless of whether he ever changes at all, regardless of whether he ever notices what's different, regardless of whether he ever offers the accountability you may have spent years hoping to eventually receive. This distinction matters enormously because it's genuinely easy, once you start implementing these behaviors and notice they visibly disrupt his usual tactics, to start measuring their success by his reaction rather than by your own experience. You might find yourself watching for whether he seems destabilized, noticing whether his usual tools stop working the way they used to, feeling a kind of quiet satisfaction each time one of his familiar strategies fails to produce the response he's expecting. This observation can be genuinely validating, confirming that your years of confusion weren't imagined, that something real was actually happening beneath the surface of every previous interaction, that your perception throughout the relationship was accurate all along. But here's the trap worth naming directly, because it's subtle enough to slip past without recognition, even after everything we've discussed. If you find yourself performing these 7 shifts specifically in order to produce a reaction in him, rather than because they genuinely serve your own well-being regardless of his response, you've quietly slipped back into exactly the orientation around his psychology that being nice always depended on in the first place. The form has changed, but the underlying structure, your behavior calibrated around his internal state, remains fundamentally the same. Real freedom requires releasing this orientation completely, not simply replacing niceness with a more sophisticated strategy still built around managing his perception of you. The real measure of success here isn't his discomfort, however satisfying that discomfort might occasionally feel to witness. It's your own gradual, accumulating sense of having reclaimed something that was always rightfully yours: your timeline, your emotional privacy, your right to make decisions without requiring his approval, your freedom from needing his understanding before you're willing to protect yourself. If these 7 shifts happen to disrupt his usual manipulation as a byproduct, that's genuinely worth acknowledging. But it was never actually the point, and treating it as the point undermines the entire foundation this approach was actually built upon. Here's what becomes possible once these shifts move from conscious practice into something closer to your natural way of moving through the world. Not just in this specific relationship, but in every future interaction where similar dynamics might eventually attempt to establish themselves again, whether with a new partner, a family member, a friend, or a colleague who shares some version of this same psychological structure. You become someone who no longer needs to be nice in order to be genuinely, deeply kind. Because here's something worth understanding clearly as we close this conversation. What we're describing today isn't the opposite of kindness. It's kindness finally freed from the requirement that it also be self-erasing, finally separated from the exhausting assumption that genuine goodness must include unlimited access, unlimited patience, and unlimited willingness to absorb consequences that were never fairly yours to carry. You can still be warm. You can still be generous, still extend genuine compassion, still offer real support to the people in your life who have actually earned it and who have demonstrated, through consistent behavior over time, genuine capacity for reciprocity. What you're releasing isn't your capacity for goodness itself. It's the specific, exhausting habit of extending that goodness indiscriminately to anyone who demands it, regardless of whether they've ever shown genuine intention of honoring it, regardless of whether they've earned it through anything resembling mutual respect. This distinction matters because it protects you from a specific kind of overcorrection that sometimes follows exactly this kind of realization. Some people, upon recognizing how thoroughly their kindness was exploited throughout a relationship with a narcissist, respond by closing off entirely, treating warmth itself as the problem rather than recognizing that the problem was always indiscriminate warmth, offered without the discernment required to protect it. This overcorrection trades one kind of imbalance for another, replacing exploitable openness with a guardedness that ultimately costs you the genuine connections you still deserve and are still capable of building with people who would never have exploited your kindness in the first place. The 7 shifts we've discussed today aren't meant to produce this kind of permanent closure. They're meant to produce discernment, the capacity to distinguish clearly between people who have earned your continued openness and people who have consistently demonstrated they haven't, and to calibrate your behavior accordingly, rather than applying either unlimited access or complete guardedness indiscriminately to everyone you encounter, regardless of how they've actually treated you. If you recognize yourself somewhere in this entire pattern, the automatic explaining, the endless second chances, the rushed forgiveness, the immediate availability, the visible reactions, the preemptive justifications, the consequences softened by performed confusion. Understand that changing this pattern doesn't require you to become someone harder, colder, or less like yourself. It requires you to become someone whose kindness finally comes with a foundation solid enough to protect it, someone whose generosity is offered deliberately rather than automatically, someone whose warmth remains fully intact while no longer being available to anyone who hasn't demonstrated they can be trusted with it. That foundation was always available to you, waiting for exactly this kind of clarity to finally construct it. You simply, understandably, hadn't yet learned that you were allowed to build it, that protecting your own kindness wasn't a betrayal of who you are, but the very thing that would finally allow that kindness to survive long enough to reach the people who actually deserved it all along. You were never required to choose between being kind and being protected. You were only ever required to stop believing those two things couldn't exist together in the same person, at the same time, finally, completely, on your own terms. I hope you like this video. Then subscribe, share, and like for more videos. Stay blessed.